The silence in the house was almost tangible, as if the air were thick with perfection. The high windows of the living room let in soft autumn sunlight that fell in golden stripes across the polished parquet. A bouquet of white lilies graced the dark walnut table, their scent subtly intertwined with the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the kitchen. Everything was perfect. The crystal vase, the immaculately ironed linen napkins, even the fruit in the glass bowl seemed surgically selected, not a spot, not a dent. Mary and Ethan Carter's house was like something out of a magazine cover, every detail screaming wealth, taste, and stability. But behind that glossy surface, something was smoldering, almost invisible, like a crack in a porcelain cup that hasn't been turned over yet. Mary stood in her second-floor bathroom, locked away from the world. Her reflection in the bronze-framed mirror was flawless. Her long brown hair flowed in soft waves, her skin glowed as if polished by her morning grooming rituals, and her ivory silk robe accentuated the curves of a body she maintained with maniacal discipline. She was 35, and she knew that men still turned heads when she looked at her. A successful career in a marketing agency, a wardrobe full of designer dresses, and a husband who never forgot an anniversary. Everything was as it should be, so why were her hands shaking and her eyes watering for no apparent reason? She turned on the faucet to drown out the sound of her own sobs. The cold water splashed in the sink, reflecting her face in a fine spray. Mary pressed her palms to her cheeks, as if trying to hold herself together in this perfect image she had carefully created over the years. "Pull yourself together, Mary," she whispered to her reflection, but her voice shook, betraying a weakness she could not allow herself. She was the perfect wife, the perfect professional, the perfect woman. But at that moment, alone in the bathroom, she felt like an empty shell, as if someone had scooped her out from the inside, leaving only her beautiful form. Downstairs, the front door slammed. Mary winced, quickly dried her face with a towel, and looked at herself in the mirror again. "You can do this," she said, but the words rang out like a lie. She took a deep breath, adjusted her robe, and walked out of the bathroom, down the wide marble stairs. Ethan was already in the kitchen, his jacket draped neatly over the back of a chair, pouring coffee into his favorite mug, plain, white, without patterns. He was 39, and he looked like a man of his age and status, trim, with neatly trimmed dark hair that was barely gray, and a shirt that cost more than their cleaning lady's monthly salary. He was a financial analyst, a man whose life was scheduled down to the minute, and this predictability was his pride. Ethan Carter was never late, never forgetful, never angry. He was as stable as a Swiss watch and just as predictable. "Good morning, my dear," he said. Not looking up from the newspaper he was flipping through on his tablet. His voice was warm, but there was no passion in it, no hint of anything that could stir her inner world. "Good morning," Mary said, forcing a smile. She walked over to the coffee machine to pour herself a cup. Her movements were practiced, as if she were acting in a play she had been rehearsing for years. "How are things at work?" Ethan shrugged, not looking up. "The usual. New client, a bunch of paperwork, a couple of meetings. Nothing special. And you?" "Same old story," she lied. In fact, her latest campaign for a major cosmetics brand had been voted best of the quarter, but she wouldn't share that. Ethan wouldn't understand why it mattered anyway. He'd never understood why she put so much effort into her work when their bank account was so good they didn't have to worry about money anyway. Mary sat down across from him, cupping her hands around the teacup. The hot ceramic burned her skin, but she didn't take her hands away. The pain was pleasant, almost alive. She looked at Ethan, at his concentrated face, and tried to remember the last time they had talked about something that really mattered. Not about bills, not about schedules, not about what to make for dinner, but about something real. About feelings, about desires, about the fact that she was fucking suffocating in this perfect house, this perfect life. "Ethan," she began, but her voice betrayed her. He looked up, and there was a slight surprise in his eyes, as if he hadn't expected her to continue the conversation. "What?" he asked, putting the tablet down. "Did something happen?" Mary opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words stuck in her throat. How do you explain to someone who never loses control that you don't understand why you feel bad? How do you talk about the emptiness that gnaws at you from the inside, when on the outside everything looks as it should? Nothing, she finally managed to say, looking away. It's just a strange day. Ethan smiled, but his smile was mechanical, like a man who knows he's being asked to react but doesn't feel it. Maybe you should take a day off, he suggested. Go to a spa, relax. You work too much. Mary nodded, though her insides twisted in irritation. Spa, of course. Another attempt to paper over the crack in their lives with nail polish. She wanted to scream that a spa wouldn't solve anything, that she wasn't tired, just lost. But instead, she just said, maybe. She stood up, put her cup in the sink, and walked out of the kitchen, her heart pounding with unspoken words. Ethan went back to his tablet, and a minute later, she heard him typing. Everything was as usual. Everything was on schedule. Things were no better in the office. Mary sat at her glass desk, surrounded by picture windows that looked out over the city. Her team was preparing a presentation for a new client, and the air in the conference room was buzzing with ideas, laughter, and a hint of tension. She should have been at the center of this vortex, guiding, inspiring, but instead she felt detached, as if she were looking at everything through thick glass. Mary, what do you think of this slogan? Asked Linda, her assistant, a young woman with fiery hair and an energy that Mary secretly envied. Linda held up a clipboard with a sketch of an advertising poster, a brightly colored photograph of a woman applying lipstick and the caption, "Unleash your power." Mary looked at the screen, but the words seemed empty. Power. What power? She herself felt nothing but tiredness and melancholy. Not bad, she said, forcing a smile. But maybe we can try something more emotional, something that hits a nerve. Linda raised her eyebrows in surprise. More emotional, she asked. You always said we needed to be concise and precise. Mary felt her cheeks heat up. She hated being caught in contradictions, but Linda was right. She was the one who always insisted on precision, on perfect wording, on everything looking perfect. But today she wanted something different, something real. Just think about it, she said, looking away. Maybe something about feelings, about what it's like to be a woman, not just look like one. Linda nodded, but there was a puzzled look in her eyes. Mary knew she sounded weird, but she didn't care. She wanted something in her life to stop being so damn right. After the meeting, she stayed in her office, looking out the window at the city. The people below seemed so small, so busy with their own lives. She wondered if any of them felt what she felt, an emptiness that could not be explained by money or success or love. She remembered how, when she was younger, she had dreamed of a life full of passion, of love that made the heart beat faster, of adventures that left a mark on the soul. And instead, she had gotten this: the perfect home, the perfect husband, the perfect career, and not a drop of what she had dreamed of. Her phone vibrated, and a message from Ethan popped up on the screen. Don't forget, dinner at the Martins tonight. 7 p.m. Love you. Mary stared at the words, I love you. They were so familiar, so automatic. When was the last time Ethan had said it to her with feeling? When was the last time he had looked at her like she was the only woman in the world? She couldn't remember. Maybe never. Dinner at the Martins was like everything else in their lives. Perfect. Their friend's house was even bigger, more luxurious than theirs, with marble columns and paintings that cost a fortune. There was a party of 6 at the table: Mary and Ethan, the hosts, John and Catherine Martin, and another couple Mary was seeing for the first time, a young architect named Lucas and his girlfriend Anna, a model with long legs and a laugh that rang like a bell. The conversations were light and superficial, about wine, about travel, about a new restaurant downtown. Mary smiled, nodded, complimented the food, but her mind was elsewhere. She looked at Lucas, who kept touching Anna's hand, whispering something in her ear, causing her to burst into laughter. There was a sincere closeness in their gestures that made Mary feel a pang of envy. Mary, you're a little quiet today, Catherine said, leaning toward her with a glass of wine. Are you okay? Oh, yeah, just tired, Mary replied, waving her hand. Work, you know. Oh, we all know what a hard worker you are, Catherine said with a smile. Ethan, you're lucky to have a wife like her. Successful, beautiful, and still finds time to cook you dinner. Ethan laughed, placing his hand on the back of Mary's chair. I won't argue, he said. She's perfect. Mary felt her throat tighten. Perfect. That word had haunted her entire life. She wanted to scream that she wasn't perfect, that she was suffocating under that label, but instead she just smiled and took a sip of wine. Lucas, sitting across from her, suddenly looked at her, and their eyes met. There was something curious in his eyes. Not lust, not pity, but something in between, as if he saw right through her, saw the Mary who had cried in the bathroom that morning. She quickly looked away, feeling her cheeks burn. And you, Lucas, what are you working on now? She asked, to fill the awkward silence. He smiled, leaning back in his chair, his dark hair slightly disheveled, and his voice with a slight huskiness that made his words lively, almost tangible. A new project in the center. A skyscraper that should become an icon of the city. But honestly, I like small projects more. Old houses that need to be restored. They have a soul, you know. They tell stories. Mary felt her heart skip a beat. Soul. Stories. When was the last time she'd thought about something like that? Her job was about sales, about numbers, about getting people to buy. But soul, that was something she was missing. It's beautiful, she said quietly, almost against her will. I mean, thinking of houses as living things. Lucas smiled wider, and something warm flickered in his gaze. And you? What do you live for, Mary? Besides work and this beautiful house? The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. What did she live for? She didn't know. Work, Ethan, commitments. But that wasn't life. It was routine. Oh, Mary lives for her career, Ethan interjected, patting her hand. She's our marketing star. Everyone laughed, and Mary felt her smile grow tighter. She looked at Lucas, expecting to see amusement in his eyes, but instead there was something else. Understanding? Sympathy? She couldn't tell. When they got home, Mary felt even more drained than she had that morning. Ethan had gone straight to the office to check his mail, and she had gone up to the bedroom, kicked off her shoes, and fallen onto the bed. The silk sheets were cool against her skin, but even that didn't bring any relief. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Lucas, about his words, about the way he'd looked at her. It was stupid, of course. He was younger, he was with another woman, and yet, something in his gaze had caught her, like a hook that pulls something long forgotten to the surface. She heard Ethan's footsteps. He entered the bedroom, already in his pajamas, and lay down next to her, not even looking at her. It's a nice evening, isn't it? He said, reaching for the lamp switch. Yes, Mary said, although that was not what she wanted to say. She wanted to ask if he noticed that she was dying inside, if he wanted her the way he used to, if he felt anything other than this damned stability. But she remained silent, as always. Ethan rolled over onto his side, and after a minute his breathing became even. He was asleep, and Mary lay in the darkness, feeling her heart beat too loudly, too vividly for this dead house. She closed her eyes and imagined Lucas, his smile, his voice, his hands touching Anna with such ease. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. 7 years. 7 years after Mary Carter, then Mary Wilson, in a crisp white Vera Wang gown, stood at the altar and promised Ethan she would love him forever. Her heart had pounded with excitement then, with the anticipation of a life of warmth and intimacy. She had looked into his calm brown eyes and seen reliability, stability, a man who would never let her down. But now, sitting at their perfectly laid dining room table, she felt like those 7 years had turned out not to be eternal love, but an endless routine, where each day was a copy of the previous one, as if life had become stuck on the same note. Mary sat across from Ethan, her fingers curled around a glass of red wine that she barely sipped. Dinner had been perfect, as always. Baked salmon with lemon sauce, steamed asparagus, and mashed potatoes with truffle oil. She had cooked it herself, not because Ethan demanded it, but because she needed something to do with her hands so she wouldn't go crazy in the silence. Their home, the same luxurious mansion with high ceilings and designer furniture, was as immaculate as it had been 7 years ago. But now it seemed less like a home to her than a stage where she played the role of the perfect wife, never allowing herself a single false note. Ethan was, as usual, immersed in his phone, scrolling through reports or answering emails. His dark hair was a little shorter now, more gray, but he still looked handsome, the kind of man any woman would consider a blessing. Caring, considerate, stable. He never forgot birthdays, anniversaries, or her favorite flowers, white lilies. But there was something mechanical about his care, as if he was following instructions rather than feelings. And Mary, looking at him, felt her heart tighten with something unspoken. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft, but with a tremor in it that she couldn't quite place. "How was your day?" He looked up from his phone, slightly surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to speak first. His smile was warm but shallow, like the sun reflected in a puddle. "Fine," he replied, putting the phone down. "New project, lots of meetings. You know how it is. And you?" Mary shrugged, looking at the salmon she didn't want to eat. Her day had been the same as always: meetings, presentations, smiles that she wore like a mask. Her agency was thriving, her name was a household word in the industry, but inside she felt empty, like a burnt-out house with only the walls left. "Same old," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "New client, new campaign. Nothing special." Ethan nodded, returning to his food. The conversation died down as quickly as it had begun. Mary looked at him, trying to find something in his face that would remind her of the Ethan she had fallen in love with. He hadn't been so flat then, or had she changed? She couldn't tell, but she knew one thing. Her body, her soul, her thoughts were screaming for something more, something she couldn't have in this house. "Maybe we could go somewhere for the weekend?" she suddenly asked, surprised by her own words. "Just the two of us. No work, no phones. Just us." Ethan raised his eyebrows, his fork hovering in midair. "Somewhere?" he asked, as if the idea was as outlandish as going to the moon. "I have a deadline next week, Mary, and I'm sure you do too." "I can take a couple of days," she said, feeling her voice grow insistent. "Ethan, we haven't been alone together I don't even remember the last time." He sighed, put his fork down, and looked at her with that soft, almost paternal smile that always made her feel like a child demanding the impossible. "Mary, you know how much I value my time with you," he said. "But now is not the best time. Maybe in a couple of months, after the quarterly report?" She nodded, though inside she was seething. In a couple of months. It had always been in a couple of months. She wanted to scream that she didn't need months, that she needed it now, that she was suffocating in this cage of schedules and commitments. But instead, she simply said, "Of course, you're right." Ethan smiled, pleased that the conflict was resolved, and went back to his salmon. Mary took a sip of wine, feeling its tart taste burn her throat. She hated herself for remaining silent again, for not being able to say that she needed more than this life, more than his care, more than this home. Later, when dinner was finished and the dishes were neatly loaded into the dishwasher, Mary went up to the bedroom. Ethan had lingered downstairs, as usual, to answer a couple of urgent letters. Their bedroom was as perfect as the rest of the house. A wide bed with silk sheets, soft light from the bedside lamps, a painting above the headboard, an abstract canvas in blue and gold that Mary had chosen because it matched the decor. But now, looking at it, she felt her chest tighten with longing. She wanted something real, something that wasn't chosen just because it matched. She undressed, pulled on a thin black silk nightgown, and climbed into bed. Her body was tense, like a string about to snap. She knew Ethan would be home soon, and she knew what would happen next. It was part of their routine. Sex on Fridays, sometimes on Sundays if he was in the mood. It was always the same. A few minutes of foreplay, careful, almost mechanical movements, and the inevitable, "Are you okay?" afterward. No passion, no surprise, no fire. Ethan was attentive, he was always mindful of her comfort, but there was no desire in his touch that could set her on fire. And Mary wanted fire. She wanted her body to burn, her mind to dissolve in the moment, to feel alive. She was lying on her side, looking out the window into the darkness when Ethan walked into the bedroom. He lay down next to her, his hand on her waist, and she felt her body instinctively tense. "Tired?" he asked, his voice soft, but nothing that would catch her attention. "A little," she lied, though tiredness was the last thing she felt. Her body was full of energy, full of desire that she didn't know where to put. Ethan kissed her neck, his lips warm, but the touch as predictable as his morning coffee. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on the moment, trying to find something in it that would wake her up. But all she felt was emptiness. His hands roamed over her body, but they weren't searching for her, not searching for her soul. It was just another task he was doing because it felt right. "Ethan," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. He froze, his hand stopping on her hip. "What?" he asked, a hint of irritation in his voice, as if she'd broken the script. Mary turned to him, her eyes shining in the dim light. She wanted to say so much, that she wanted more, that she wanted to feel, that she wanted him to look at her as if she were the only woman in the world. But instead she said, "Maybe we should try something new." He frowned, clearly not understanding. "New?" he asked again. "What do you mean?" Mary felt her cheeks heat up. She didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell your husband of 7 years that his touch doesn't excite you? How do you admit that you dream of something you can't even describe? "I don't know," she said, looking away. "It's just different, something unexpected." Ethan laughed, but his laugh was dry, almost condescending. "Mary, you know I'm not one for surprises," he said, kissing her neck again. "Let's just do it the usual way, okay?" She nodded, though inside she was screaming with disappointment. They continued, and everything was the same as always. Neat, predictable, without a spark. When it was over, Ethan rolled over and fell asleep almost immediately, and Mary lay staring at the ceiling, feeling her body tremble with pent-up energy. She wanted to scream, to punch the pillow, but instead she just lay there, listening to her husband's even breathing and feeling her soul drown in the silence. The next day, Mary decided she needed to make a change. Not in her marriage, she wasn't ready for that conversation yet, but in herself. She signed up for a yoga class, which her friend Catherine had been recommending for months. "It'll change your life," Catherine said, with that excited smile that always made Mary feel a little out of place. "You'll find peace, balance, everything." Mary wasn't sure she wanted peace. She needed fire, passion, something to make her heart beat faster. But she decided to try. Maybe it was better than nothing. The yoga studio was in the center of town, an old building with tall windows and wooden floors that creaked underfoot. The air smelled of sandalwood incense, and soft flute music blared from speakers. Mary felt out of her element, but something about the place, its simplicity, its calm, made her relax. The instructor, a woman named Sophia, was tall, with long black hair pulled back into a braid and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She smiled at Mary as she unrolled her mat. "New?" Sophia asked, her voice low, almost hypnotic. "Yes," Mary answered, feeling awkward under her gaze. "A friend recommended it." "Okay," Sophia said, her smile widening. "Just breathe and listen to your body. It knows what it wants." Mary nodded, though Sophia's words were a riddle. Listen to her body. She wasn't sure her body was saying anything at all. But as the class began, she felt her muscles come alive, her breathing deepen, her thoughts, usually so chaotic, begin to calm. Sophia moved between the mats, adjusting poses, her hands warm and sure, and when she touched Mary's shoulder to help her into warrior pose, Mary felt her skin flush. "Relax," Sophia said quietly, her voice like a whisper in the wind. "You're holding on to too much tension." Mary wanted to ask how she knew, but she just nodded, focusing on her breathing. After the class, she felt strange, tired, and energized at the same time. Sophia came up to her as she was rolling up her mat. "How do you like it?" she asked, her eyes studying Mary with curiosity. "It's unusual," Mary answered honestly. "But, okay, I think I'll be back." "Come back," Sophia said, her smile warm, but there was something else in it, something that made Mary's heart beat faster. Sometimes all we need is a place where we can be ourselves. Mary left the studio feeling a little dizzy. She wasn't sure what had happened, but for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. Not a perfect wife, not a successful career woman, but simply a woman who could still feel. When she got home, she found Ethan in the living room, watching some financial channel. He didn't even look up when she walked in. "How's yoga?" he asked, without looking up from the screen. "Okay," Mary replied, feeling her enthusiasm fading under his indifference. "I think I'll go regularly." "Fine," he said, his voice as flat as ever. "As long as you like it." Mary looked at him, at his profile, illuminated by the blue light of the television, and suddenly realized that she could no longer remain silent. "Ethan," she said, her voice firmer than she expected, "we need to talk." He turned to face her, his eyebrows raised in mild surprise. "About what?" he asked. Mary took a deep breath. She didn't know where to begin, but she knew that if she didn't say it now, she never would. "About us," she said. "About what's happening. Or not happening." Ethan frowned, his face becoming serious. "Mary, what do you mean?" he asked. "Everything is fine with us. The house, the job, ourselves. What's wrong?" She felt her throat tighten. How to explain to a man who only saw the surface that there was a storm beneath? How to tell him about the passion she had never felt with him, the emptiness that grew with each passing day? "I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice shaking. "But I don't feel happy, Ethan. I feel like we're just existing, together, but not really." He looked at her, his eyes full of confusion. "Mary, I don't understand," he said. "I'm doing everything I can. I care about you, about our home, about our life. What do you miss?" "You," she blurted, her voice breaking. "I miss you. Not your care, not your gifts, but you. The one who sees me, who wants me, who, I don't know, Ethan, who makes me feel alive." Ethan looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, a mixture of hurt and confusion. "Mary, I don't know what you want from me," he said finally. "I'm trying. I always try. If you need something specific, just say so." But she didn't know what to say, how to explain that she didn't want something specific, but everything. How to explain that she wanted him to look at her like she was a miracle, not a liability. She shook her head, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "Forget it," she said quietly. "Just forget it." She turned and walked into the bedroom, leaving him in the living room. Ethan didn't follow her, and for that she was grateful. She curled up in her bed, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cry. Not in the bathroom, not hiding, but openly, feeling the tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She couldn't live the way she had been. Something had to change, and maybe that change would start with her. The autumn evening cast a soft twilight over the city, and the streets, bathed in lantern light, seemed alive and breathing. Mary walked along the sidewalk, her heels clicking on the wet asphalt, reflecting the rhythm of her restless thoughts. She hadn't planned to linger in the center after work, but Catherine's invitation to the opening of a new gallery had proven too tempting to refuse. "It's going to be something special," Catherine said over the phone, her voice shaking with excitement. "Julian Rhodes, the photographer everyone's talking about right now, is going to be there. His work is just explosive." Mary agreed, although deep down she knew she was going not for the art, but for the chance to escape her routine, even if only for a few hours. The gallery was in an old industrial building that had been converted into an exhibition space. The high ceilings, bare brick walls, and dim spotlights focused on the photographs created an atmosphere that was both cold and intimate. People moved slowly around her, holding glasses of wine, whispering, looking at the works. Mary felt like an outsider in this world, a world where everyone seemed to know how to talk about feelings, about beauty, about meaning. Her world was a world of numbers, contracts, and perfect facades. But today, something was drawing her here, as if she were searching for an answer she had not yet formulated. She stopped in front of one of the photographs, a black and white portrait of a woman whose face was half hidden in shadow. Her eyes, full of pain and desire, looked straight into her soul. Mary froze, feeling her heart squeeze. This woman was a stranger to her, but there was something painfully familiar in her gaze, the same longing, the same hunger for something more that Mary hid even from herself. "Do you like her?" came a voice from behind her, low and slightly hoarse, as if its owner had just smoked a cigarette. Mary turned around and met the gaze of a man who was looking at her curiously. He was in his early 30s, with tousled dark hair falling over his forehead and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He wore a black shirt, unbuttoned at the top, and jeans that looked like he had been wearing them for years. His smile was both warm and dangerous, as if he knew a secret that could destroy her world. "Yes," Mary answered, trying to sound confident. "She's real." The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze sliding over her face, as if he were studying her like one of his photographs. "Real," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's what I'm looking for. Real. No masks, no pretense. Julian Rhodes, by the way." He held out his hand, and Mary noticed that his fingers were stained with what looked like paint. "Mary Carter," she said, shaking his hand. His skin was warm, his grip a little too firm, as if he wanted to keep her attention. "Mary," he said, tasting her name like wine. "You don't seem like your typical gallery goer. What brings you here?" She shrugged, feeling her cheeks flush slightly under his gaze. "A friend invited me, and I don't know. I just wanted something new." Julian smiled, and there was something in his smile that made her heart beat faster. He stepped closer, so that she caught a whiff of his cologne, something tart, with notes of wood and citrus. "Something new," he repeated, his voice quieter, almost intimate. "You know, Mary, I see people, not just their faces, but what they hide. And there's a tension in you, like you're holding something inside, and it's trying to get out." Mary felt her throat tighten. His words were too precise, too close to the truth. She wanted to laugh it off, to walk away, but something in his gaze held her in place. "You speak as if you know me," she said, trying to make her voice sound light, but it wavered. "I don't know you," Julian said, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I would like to. I would like to photograph you, the real you, without this mask you wear." Mary laughed, but it sounded nervous. "Take a picture of me?" she asked again. "You mean a photograph?" "Not just a photograph," he said, his voice even lower, almost conspiratorial. "A portrait, a provocative one that shows who you are when no one is looking, when you're not afraid to be yourself." Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Provocative. The word hung in the air like a spark, ready to start a fire. She knew she should refuse, that this was dangerous, that this was not her world. But something in his words, his look, his certainty, caught her like a hook. "I'm not a model," she said, looking away. "And I'm married." Julian nodded, his smile not fading but softening a little. "This isn't about the model, Mary," he said. "This is about you, about what you're hiding. I'm not asking you to undress in front of the camera. I'm asking you to be honest, at least for one frame." She looked at him, and there was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen in Ethan's for years. Hunger. Not lust, not vulgar desire, but a deep, almost animalistic interest in her soul, in her secrets. It was frightening, and at the same time alluring. "I'll think about it," she said finally, feeling her voice tremble. Julian pulled a business card out of his pocket and handed it to her. It only had his name and phone number on it, handwritten. "Call me," he said, "when you're ready, or when you decide you're tired of hiding." Mary took the card, her fingers shaking slightly. She was about to say something when Catherine called out to her, making her way through the crowd with 2 glasses of champagne. "Mary, "There you are," she cried, her eyes shining with excitement. "Have you met Julian yet? He's a genius, isn't he?" Julian smiled at Catherine, but his gaze returned to Mary. "We're just getting to know each other," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her skin crawl. Catherine pulled her toward another part of the gallery, chatting about photographs and how Julian was turning art on its head. But Mary was barely listening. Her mind was on his words, his look, his offer. She clutched the card in her hand, feeling the paper cut into her palm. When Mary got home, Ethan was already in bed, reading something on his tablet. He looked up when she entered the bedroom and smiled his usual warm but empty smile. "How was the exhibition?" he asked, putting his tablet down. "Interesting," she said, taking off her coat. Her voice was even, but inside she was seething. "Lots of people, lots of talk." "Did you have a good time?" he asked, and there was not a drop of curiosity in his voice. "Yes," she lied, even though she wanted to say that for the first time in a long time she felt alive. She wanted to tell him about Julian, about what he had said, about the way he had looked at her, but she knew Ethan wouldn't understand. To him, it would just be another exhibition, another evening that meant nothing. Mary undressed and got into bed, feeling the card hidden in her purse burn like coal. She lay in the dark, listening to Ethan's even breathing, and thought about Julian, about his voice, his eyes, his proposal, a provocative portrait, the real her. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew one thing. She was tired of hiding, and perhaps for the first time in 7 years, she was ready to step into the unknown. The next day, Mary sat in her office, staring at the business card she'd pulled out of her purse. Her fingers fiddled with the edges of the paper, as if she could find the answer there. She knew it was dangerous. She knew it could destroy everything she'd spent years building. But the thought of being trapped in this cage, in this perfect but empty life, was even scarier. She picked up the phone and dialed the number. After 2 rings, his voice came through the same low, hoarse, full of life. "Julian Rhodes," he said. "It's Mary," she said, her voice shaking. I'm ready." He paused, and she could almost see his smile through the phone. "Excellent," he said finally. "Tomorrow, 8 o'clock. My studio. I'll send you the address." She hung up the phone, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she was getting into, but she knew one thing. She couldn't just be the perfect wife anymore. She wanted to be herself. And maybe Julian Rhodes was the one who could help her do that. The evening was cool, with a hint of autumn approaching. Mary stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, examining herself with an unusually critical eye. She had chosen a simple black dress with a low back, nothing too revealing, but just bold enough to show off her figure. Her hair, usually neatly styled, fell in soft waves today, as if she had let it hang a little looser. She hadn't known what to expect from this photo shoot, but Julian's words, "the real you," rang in her head like an echo. She wanted to be real, if only for one evening. Ethan was downstairs in his office, immersed in his work as always. When she told him she was going to a photo shoot, he just nodded, his eyes glued to the screen. "That sounds interesting," he said, "but don't stay out too late." His indifference stung, but she swallowed it, as she had swallowed everything else for the past 7 years. She threw on her coat, grabbed her purse, and walked out the door, her heart beating a little faster than usual. Julian's studio was in a loft on the outskirts of town, in an area where old warehouses had been converted into trendy art spaces. The building was shabby on the outside, with peeling paint and rusty fire escapes, but inside it was a different story. The ceilings were high, the windows were huge and softly lighted by streetlights, and the walls were covered with photographs, black and white, color, abstract, and disturbingly candid. The air smelled of coffee and old paper, and something else Mary couldn't quite place, maybe the spirit of creativity itself. Julian met her at the entrance, wearing a black t-shirt and faded jeans. His hair was as wild as it had been at the exhibition, and his eyes held the same hungry glint that had made her agree to this madness. He smiled, and it was both warm and dangerous, as if he knew she was already hooked. "Mary," he said, his voice low, almost velvety, "I'm glad you came. Do you feel ready?" She nodded, though her fingers fiddled nervously with the strap of her purse. I don't know what ready means, she admitted honestly. I've never done anything like this. Julian laughed, and his laugh was light but not mocking. He motioned for her to follow him into the back of the studio, where the lights were already set up, the camera on a tripod, and a large white backdrop slightly dented as if it had witnessed 100 stories. It's not about doing, he said, removing the lens cap. It's about being. Just be yourself. I'll do it. Mary took off her coat and hung it on a chair, feeling vulnerable under his gaze. She wasn't naked, her dress clung tightly to her body, but she still felt naked. Julian didn't look at her the way Ethan did, or the way her colleagues or friends did. His gaze was like a touch, not physical, but deep, penetrating, as if he could see not just her skin, but everything she hid beneath it. Sit here, he said, gesturing to a wooden chair in the middle of the studio. And just breathe. Don't think about the camera. Think about how you feel. Mary sat up, her back straight, but she immediately caught herself trying to look correct. Julian noticed and shook his head. Don't, he said softly. Don't try to be perfect. You're too beautiful for that. Her cheeks flushed, and she looked down, feeling his words sink deep inside her. She wasn't used to compliments that sounded so sincere, so personal. Ethan told her she was beautiful, but it was always part of their routine, like he had to say it. And Julian, he spoke as if he saw something in her that she didn't see herself. He began filming, moving around her with the camera, like a predator studying its prey. But there was no aggression in his movements, only a focus, almost an obsession. The click of the camera shutter sounded over and over, and each sound was a small explosion, awakening something in her chest. She felt her body relax, her shoulders drop, her breathing deepen. Julian didn't give her any directions, didn't ask her to turn her head or smile. He simply looked, and his gaze was like a magnet, drawing out of her everything she had hidden for so long. Tell me something, he said suddenly, without looking away from the camera. Something you've never told anyone. Mary froze, her fingers curling around the edge of her chair. She wanted to make a joke, to say something light, but his voice, his presence, his eyes behind the camera demanded the truth. She began, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. I'm afraid that I've forgotten who I am, that I've become just a shadow, the shadow of a wife, the shadow of a career woman, the shadow of the woman I wanted to be. Julian lowered the camera, his eyes meeting hers, and there was something in them that made her heart skip a beat. Not pity, not surprise, but understanding. Like he knew what she was talking about before she even opened her mouth. You're not a shadow, Mary, he said, his voice firm but gentle. You're just hiding, but I see you, and I want you to see yourself. He raised the camera again, and the shutter clicked again. Mary felt her eyes water, but she didn't look away. She looked straight into the lens, straight into him, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to be perfect. She allowed herself to feel it, the pain, the longing, the desire, all the things she'd been suppressing for years. And Julian caught it, every look, every emotion, every flutter of her eyelashes. Turn slightly to the left, he said, his voice quieter, almost intimate. And lift your chin. Don't be afraid to show yourself. She did as he asked, and felt her body respond to his words. It wasn't just a movement, it was a release. She felt her skin burn under his gaze, her breathing quicken, her heart beat so loudly she was afraid he'd hear it. But he didn't touch her, didn't come closer. His touch was in his eyes, in his voice, in the way he guided her, as if he knew what she wanted even better than she did. That's it, he whispered, his voice like a caress. You're beautiful, Mary, not because you're perfect, because you're alive. She felt the tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She didn't want to cry, not now, when for the first time in years she felt like a woman, not a shadow. A woman who was seen, a woman who was desired. The photo shoot lasted about an hour, but for Mary, time lost its meaning. Every click of the camera, every glance from Julian was a step toward something new, something she was afraid to even name. When he finally lowered the camera and said, "Done," she felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. She didn't want it to end. "Do you want to see?" he asked, walking over to the laptop connected to the camera. Mary nodded, her legs weak as she walked toward him. Photos began to appear on the screen, her face, her eyes, her lips, her emotions. She barely recognized herself. This was not the Mary who looked in the mirror every morning, putting on the mask of the perfect wife. This was a woman full of life, full of pain, full of desire. Her eyes were shining, her lips were slightly parted, her skin seemed to glow from within. She was beautiful, not the glossy beauty she was used to, but something deeper, something more real. "Is it me?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Julian smiled, standing so close that she could feel the warmth of his body. "It's you," he said, "the real you. And she's damn beautiful." Mary looked at him, and for a moment she thought he was going to lean over and kiss her. But he didn't. He just looked, and that was enough to make her skin crawl and fill her body with a heat she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking away. She was afraid that if she looked at him any longer, she would do something she would regret. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice full of promise. "If you want, we can continue. Let's go deeper." She didn't answer, but his words echoed in her head. Deeper. She didn't know if she was ready for this, but she knew one thing. She couldn't go back to the way things were before. It was past midnight when Mary got home. Ethan was asleep, his breathing as regular as ever. She quietly undressed, put on her nightgown, and climbed into bed, but sleep would not come. Her body was tense, her skin still burning from Julian's gaze, from his words, from the way he had made her feel alive. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling her fingers tremble, her breathing quicken, her body demanding something she couldn't have here in this cold, perfect bedroom. She closed her eyes and imagined Julian, his eyes, his voice, his hands that never touched hers, but that she could feel on her skin. She knew it was dangerous. She knew it could destroy everything she had built. But for the first time in 7 years, she didn't want to be perfect. She wanted to be herself. And that thought, so simple and so terrifying, made her heart beat faster than ever. Mornings in the Carter house began with perfect precision, like a metronome beating out the rhythm of their lives. Mary rose at 7, her movements honed by years of habit, making coffee, making breakfast and avocado omelet for Ethan, toast with almond butter for herself. She glided around the kitchen in the soft light of the morning sun streaming through the tall windows, her hands moving automatically, like a dancer performing a routine he knew by heart. She was the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, and everything in their home, from Ethan's immaculately ironed shirts to the freshly cut lilies on the table, confirmed it. But something had changed inside Mary. Her heart beat to a different rhythm, and the rhythm was ragged, alive, almost frightening. 2 weeks had passed since that first photo shoot with Julian, and Mary seemed to be living in two worlds. In the morning, she was Mary Carter, successful, reserved, the one who smiled at Ethan over breakfast and discussed the weather or their weekend plans. But in the evenings, when she said she was going to yoga or meeting with Catherine, she was someone else. Not a model, not an actress, but a woman who, for the first time in a long time, was allowing herself to feel. She returned to Julian's studio twice a week, telling herself each time that it would be her last, that she must not cross the line. But each time she returned, like a moth to a flame, knowing she might burn out, but unable to stop. Ethan didn't notice. His life was too structured, too predictable, for him to notice the subtle changes in her demeanor. He didn't see how her eyes sparkled a little brighter now, how her movements became a little more fluid, almost cat-like. He didn't notice that she began wearing bolder clothes, not provocative, but with just a hint of daring. A dress with a slightly lower neckline, a blouse that showed through slightly when the light hit it at just the right angle. He didn't notice how her smile, always so measured, sometimes seemed distant now, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. "You seem thoughtful today," Ethan said one morning as they sat at the table. He held a cup of coffee, his gaze flicking over it, but not lingering. Mary looked at him, her fingers hovering over the edge of her toast. She wanted to say something, maybe the truth, maybe a hint that her world was falling apart. But instead, she just smiled, the same smile she had spent years honing. "Just tired," she replied, her voice light as a feather. "Lots of work." Ethan nodded, his attention already returning to his tablet, where he was reviewing the morning news. "Don't overexert yourself," he said, without looking up. "Maybe take a day off. Let's go to a spa this weekend." Mary felt her throat tighten. Spa. That word again, like a universal cure for everything he didn't want to understand. She wanted to scream that she didn't need a spa, that she needed to feel, to live, to breathe deeply. But instead she just said, "Maybe." She stood up, cleared her plate, and walked out of the kitchen, her heart pounding. She hated herself for lying, for hiding behind a mask again. But the truth was too hard, too dangerous. She didn't know how to tell Ethan that her soul was being torn apart, that she could no longer be the woman he'd married, and that maybe she never was. That evening, Mary found herself back in Julian's studio. The loft greeted her with the familiar smell of coffee and old paper, but there was something else in the air today, a faint scent of incense, sandalwood, with a hint of something tart. Julian was already there, fiddling with the camera, his movements light, almost dance-like. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms covered in thin scars that Mary didn't dare ask about. He looked up as she entered, and his smile was a ray of light in the darkness. "Mary," he said, his voice warm, but with a slight huskiness that made her skin crawl. "You look alive today." She laughed, though it sounded nervous. "Is that a compliment?" she asked, taking off her coat and hanging it on a hook by the entrance. "It's true," he said, his eyes sliding over her, not with vulgar lust, but with the same hungry attentiveness that had so captivated her the first time. "You're starting to glow, like something inside you is waking up." Mary felt her cheeks heat up. She wanted to brush his words aside, to say something light, but instead she nodded, at a loss for words. Julian pointed to a corner of the studio where today, instead of the usual white backdrop, there was a dark blue velvet spread, softly draped like the night sky. Nearby stood an old couch upholstered in worn leather and several candles, their flames casting a warm glow on the walls. "Today is going to be something different," he said, adjusting the spotlights. "No chairs, no poses. Just lie down on the couch and be like you're alone in the world." Mary felt her heart pound. She walked toward the couch, her movements cautious, as if she were treading on thin ice. She lay down, her body sinking into the soft leather, and she suddenly felt vulnerable, but not in a bad way. It was a vulnerability that was freeing, like shedding a heavy cloak. Julian began filming, his camera clicking quietly, almost imperceptibly. He moved around her, sometimes crouching to get the right angle, sometimes stepping back to take in all of her. His gaze was like a touch not physical, but deep, penetrating, making her skin burn. "Tell me," he said suddenly, his voice soft but insistent. "What do you feel when you lie here?" Mary closed her eyes, her breathing uneven. She wasn't used to talking about feelings and wasn't used to being so open. But something in his voice, in his presence, made her want to be honest. "I feel," she began, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "I feel alive, for the first time in a long time. But I also feel afraid, like I'm standing on the edge of something, and I don't know if I'm going to fall or fly." Julian lowered the camera, his eyes meeting hers, and there was something in them she couldn't describe, a mixture of admiration and understanding. "That's you, Mary," he said, "the one standing on the edge, the one ready to fly. Don't be afraid of it." She looked at him, her lips parted slightly, and in that moment she felt her body respond to his words, to his gaze, to his presence. It wasn't lust, or maybe it was, but not in the vulgar sense she was used to. It was a desire to be seen, to be understood, to be desired not for her mask, but for what was underneath it. "Turn your head to the side a little," he said, his voice quieter, almost intimate, "and think of something that makes your heart beat faster." Mary turned her head, her hair spilling across the couch, and she thought of him, of Julian. of the way he looked at her, the way he spoke to her, the way he made her feel alive. She knew it was wrong, that she was married, that she shouldn't allow herself to think these thoughts. But in that moment, in that studio, under his gaze, she didn't want to be right. She wanted to be herself. The camera clicks continued, but they became background, almost music. Julian moved closer, his breath audible in the quiet of the studio, and Mary felt her skin burn, her body tense with the invisible electricity between them. He did not touch her, but his gaze was a caress, as if he knew every curve of her soul. "You know you're beautiful," he said suddenly, his voice hoarse, almost broken. "Not like a model, not like a picture, like a woman who burns from within." Mary felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. She just looked at him, her eyes shining in the candlelight, and in that moment she was ready to throw herself into the abyss he had opened for her. The photo shoot ended too quickly. Julian put the camera down, his movements slow, almost reluctant. "Do you want to see?" he asked, approaching the laptop. Mary nodded, her legs weak as she rose from the couch. The pictures appeared on the screen, her face, her body, her emotions. She looked not just beautiful, but alive, full of a fire she hadn't seen in herself in years. Her eyes were full of longing, desire, strength. This wasn't Mary Carter, the perfect wife. This was Mary, the woman who wanted to live. "This is incredible," she whispered, her voice trembling. Julian stood next to her, so close that she could feel the warmth of his body. "It's you," he said, "and I want to see you again, if you'll let me." She looked at him, her heart pounding. She knew she should say no, that she should leave, go back to her life, to Ethan, to safety. But instead she nodded. "I'll be back," she said quietly. He smiled, and there was a mixture of triumph and something else in his smile that she couldn't quite place. "I'll wait," he said. It was past midnight when Mary got home. Ethan was asleep, his breathing as regular as a metronome. She quietly undressed, put on her nightgown, and got into bed, but her body was too alive, too full of energy to sleep. She could feel her skin still burning from Julian's gaze, her heart beating in a rhythm she had forgotten. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, imagining his eyes, his voice, his words. She knew it was dangerous, that she was playing with fire, but at that moment she didn't want to put out the fire. She wanted to burn. In the morning, she was Mary Carter again, the perfect wife, the perfect professional. She made breakfast, smiled at Ethan, and discussed his plans for the day. But there was something else in her now, a secret she carried inside her like a jewel hidden in her pocket. She knew she couldn't go on like this forever, that sooner or later she would have to make a choice. But for now, she just wanted to live in this nocturne, in this secret world where she was not a shadow, but a woman full of fire. It was a cold evening, with a sharp wind that cut right to the bone. Mary stood at the entrance to Julian's studio, her fingers fiddling nervously with the strap of her purse, her heart pounding as if she were about to commit a crime. She had been here 3 times in the last 2 weeks, telling herself each time that this was the last, that she should stop before things went too far. But each time she returned, as if some invisible thread was pulling her back to this loft, to his camera, to his voice, to his eyes that saw the real her. Today she wore a dark green dress, fitted but not revealing, with long sleeves and a neckline that left her back a little more exposed than she was used to. Her hair was down, slightly tousled by the wind, and she felt both vulnerable and alive. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the shaking in her hands, and pressed the doorbell. Julian opened the door almost immediately. He was wearing a black t-shirt, worn, with a neckline that showed his collarbones, and jeans that fit him like they were made especially for him. His hair was a little messy, as always, and his eyes had the same fire that made her forget who she was and where she belonged. "Mary," he said, his voice warm and slightly husky, as if he'd just spoken to someone on the phone. "You look dangerous today." She laughed, but it sounded nervous. "Dangerous?" she asked, walking inside. "Does this make me look like a femme fatale?" He closed the door behind her, and his smile grew wider, but there was something new about it, something that made her skin crawl. Not exactly, he said, looking at her as if he could see right into her soul. But there's something inside you, something that wants to get out, and I want to catch it. Mary felt her cheeks heat up. She hung her coat on a hook and walked into the studio. There was less light than usual today, just a single spotlight casting soft shadows and a few candles whose flames flickered in the draft. A bed of dark silk stood in the background, and Mary froze, her breathing uneven. "A bed?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "What's that for?" Julian turned to face her, his camera already in his hands, but he was in no hurry to pick it up. "For you," he said simply. "I want to go further, Mary. I want to photograph you not just as you are, but naked. Not in the sense of clothes, though." He paused, his eyes sliding over her figure, and she felt her body respond with heat. "Though that could be beautiful, too. But I'm talking about emotion, about vulnerability, about what you hide even from yourself." Mary felt her throat tighten. She knew what he meant, but his words were too close to the truth, too frightening. She shook her head, her fingers curling into fists. "I can't," she said, her voice firm but shaking. "It's too much. I'm not ready." Julian set the camera down on the table and stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but his presence was like an electric shock running across her skin. "Mary," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "You're afraid, I can see that. But you know what else I can see? You're tired of being afraid, tired of hiding. You come here because you want to be yourself. So be yourself. Let me show you who you really are." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. His words were like a knife cutting through her defenses, and she hated him for it, and at the same time wanted him to continue. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I have a husband, Julian. I have a life. I can't just up and ruin it all." He tilted his head, his gaze so intense that she felt her heart skip a beat. "What will you destroy?" he asked quietly. "The life that suffocates you? Mary, I see you. You are not happy. You are not alive. You are playing a role, and it is killing you." "It's not that simple," she blurted, her voice growing louder. "You think I can just up and throw everything away? My marriage, my home, my career? This isn't a game, Julian. This is my life." He stepped closer, less than a step between them now. She could feel the warmth of his body, the scent of his cologne, something tart, with notes of wood and sea. "I'm not asking you to give up anything," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm asking you to be honest. With yourself. With me. At least here, in this room." Mary looked at the bed, at the dark silk that seemed so inviting and so frightening. She knew he was right. She was tired of hiding, tired of being the perfect wife, the perfect professional, the perfect shadow. But the step he was proposing was too big, too dangerous. "I can't," she repeated, but her voice was no longer as firm. I don't know how." Julian smiled, and there was something in his smile that both calmed and fired her up. "Then let's start small," he said. "Sit on the bed. Just sit. Nothing more." She looked at him, her breathing ragged. She wanted to refuse, to leave, to go back to her safe, predictable life. But her legs were already moving, as if obeying not her mind, but something deeper. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands on the silk, and she felt the fabric cool against her skin. "There you go," Julian said, holding up the camera. "Now look at me. Don't think. Just look." She looked up, and their gazes met. His were dark, almost black in the candlelight, and there was so much life in them, so much desire, that she felt her body respond, as if someone had flipped a switch inside her that she had forgotten. The click of the camera was like a gunshot, but she didn't flinch. She looked at him, and in that moment, the whole world, Ethan, her home, her job vanished. It was just the two of them, and it was both terrifying and liberating. "Tell me," he said, his voice soft, but with a power that compelled her to speak. "What are you feeling right now?" Mary swallowed, her fingers tightening on the silk. "I feel," she began, her voice shaking. "I feel like I want to be here, like I want you to look at me, like I want more. He lowered the camera, his eyes never leaving hers. More than what? He asked, his voice hoarse, almost broken. She didn't answer with words. She just looked at him, her lips slightly parted, and her gaze held everything she couldn't say. Julian set the camera down on the table, his movement slow but determined. He walked over to her, sat next to her on the bed, so close that she could feel the warmth of his body, his breath, his presence. "Mary," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "you know I want you, not just for the camera. You." She froze, her heart beating so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She knew she should get up, leave, tell him it was a mistake. But instead she leaned toward him, her face so close she could see every line in his eyes, every wrinkle in his skin. "I'm married," she whispered, but her voice was weak, as if she was trying to convince herself, not him. "I know," he said, his hand coming up but stopping a centimeter from her cheek. "But you're here, with me, because you want to be." She closed her eyes, her breathing ragged. She felt her body reaching for him, her skin burning with his closeness. She knew it was wrong, that it would ruin everything, but at that moment she couldn't think about the future. She only wanted this moment, this fire he had lit inside her. "Julian," she whispered, her voice full of the desire she had suppressed for so long. He leaned toward her, and their lips met. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it wasn't careful. It was an explosion, as if everything they'd been holding back, all the looks, all the words, all the unspoken desires had burst forth. His lips were warm, insistent, and she responded with equal passion, her hands finding his shoulders, her fingers digging into his skin. She felt her body come alive, her blood rushing, her heart pounding as if it wanted to burst out of her chest. The kiss lasted seconds, but to Mary it felt like an eternity. When they finally pulled away, her breathing was heavy, her eyes were shining, and her body was shaking with adrenaline. Julian looked at her, his chest rising and falling as if he was trying to catch his breath, too. "Mary," he said, his voice hoarse, "we can stop, if you want." She looked at him, her lips still burning from his touch. She knew she should say yes, that she should get up and leave, but instead she shook her head. He smiled, and there was something in his smile that both scared and drew her. He leaned in again, but this time his kiss was slower, deeper, as if he wanted to memorize every taste, every breath. Mary felt her world crumbling, her marriage, her life, her mask of the perfect wife. But at that moment, she didn't want to think about the consequences. She wanted only him, only this fire he had lit inside her. It was past midnight when Mary returned home. Ethan was asleep, his breathing as regular as ever. She undressed quietly, her movements slow, as if she were afraid to upset a delicate balance. She lay down on the bed, but her body was too alive, too full of energy to sleep. Her lips were still burning from Julian's kiss. Her skin remembered his look, his voice, his breath. She knew she had crossed a line, that there was no turning back now. But instead of fear, she felt something else, freedom. For the first time in 7 years, she felt not like a shadow, but like a woman who could choose her own destiny. And this thought, so frightening and so alluring, made her heart beat faster than ever. Mary, whom Julian sometimes called Marina in the heat of passion, came home after the night their lips first met, and felt as if someone had turned on a light in the room where she had been wandering in the dark for years. Her world, previously black and white, like an old film, suddenly burst into color, bright, frightening, but so vivid that she could not look away. Every step she took, every breath she took, was filled with a new sensation. She was a woman who desired and was desired. But with that light came a shadow, a sense of guilt that burned like cold water inside her, reminding her of what she had left behind. The morning began as usual. Coffee, an omelet for Ethan, toast for her. She moved around the kitchen as if she were performing a role in a play she knew by heart. But today her hands shook as she cut the avocado, and her thoughts were elsewhere, in Julian's studio, in his gaze, in his lips that had left a mark on her skin that she could still feel. She tried to focus on the familiar movements, the familiar rhythm of their lives, but everything felt foreign, as if she were looking at her life through glass. Ethan walked into the kitchen, his steps as measured as ever. He looked the same as always, neatly pressed shirt, hair slightly grayed, and a face that never showed a trace of worry. But today his gaze lingered on her a little longer than usual. "Are you okay?" he asked, sitting down at the table and picking up a cup of coffee. His voice was calm, but there was something new about it, a slight wariness, as if he sensed a crack in their perfect facade. Mary froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the tabletop. She wanted to say yes, as always, but her voice betrayed her. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. "I just didn't get enough sleep." Ethan nodded, but his eyes still searched her, as if he was looking for something he couldn't find. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice soft but with a hint of doubt. "Is everything okay? Work? Or something else?" Mary felt her heart pound. She knew he didn't suspect Julian, he wasn't the type to look for a catch. But his words were too close to the truth, and it scared her. She turned to the sink to hide her face and began washing a plate, even though it was already clean. "It's okay, Ethan," she said, her voice even but her inside seething. "Just a lot going on, you know how it is." He paused, and she heard him take a sip of coffee. "I know," he said finally, "but if something's wrong, you'll tell me, right?" Mary nodded without turning around. She couldn't look him in the eye, not now, not when her skin still remembered the touch of another man, not when her thoughts were full of his voice, his scent, his fire. "Of course," she lied, her voice barely audible. Ethan stood up, walked over to her, and placed his hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm, familiar, but it did nothing but make her feel guilty, tightening her throat. "I just want you to be happy," he said, and there was a sincerity in his voice that made everything worse. Mary forced herself to turn and smile. "I know," she said. "Thank you." He kissed her forehead, as he did every morning, and went into his office. Mary stood at the sink, her hands shaking, a lump growing in her chest that she couldn't swallow. She was happy, or at least as close to happy as she had been in years. But that happiness was poisoned by guilt, which, like poison, was slowly eating away at her from the inside. That evening, Mary was back in Julian's studio. She hadn't planned on going back so soon, but after her morning conversation with Ethan, she felt suffocated. She needed to get out, to feel alive, even if it meant crossing another line. She wore a deep red dress, almost burgundy, with thin straps that she had bought on impulse and never worn. It was too bold for her everyday life, but for Julian, for the Mary she was becoming with him, it was perfect. Julian met her at the door, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Damn it, Mary," he said, his voice hoarse, almost broken. "You look like a fire." She laughed, but it sounded nervous. "Is that a compliment?" she asked as she walked inside. "It's a warning," he said, closing the door. His gaze slid over her, and she felt her skin burn beneath his eyes. "You look like you're ready to burn everything to the ground." Mary swallowed, her fingers tightening on the strap of her purse. "Maybe I do," she said, her voice quieter than she expected. Julian looked at her, his smile slow, almost predatory. "Then go ahead," he said. "Burn it all. But first, let me capture this." He pointed to a corner of the studio where today there was no bed, no backdrop, just black velvet draped on the floor, and a single spotlight casting a soft, almost intimate light. "Sit there," he said, "and just be. Don't do anything. Just breathe." Mary nodded, her legs weak as she walked over to the velvet and sank down onto it. She sat with her legs tucked under her dress riding up slightly, revealing one knee, and she didn't bother to adjust it. She looked at Julian, who was already holding the camera, his movements fluid, almost hypnotic. "I want to go further, Mary," he said, his voice low, as if he were speaking only to her. "I want to take you, without protection, without masks. Are you ready?" She felt her heart pound. She knew what he meant, not just the clothes, but everything she was hiding. The fear, the guilt, the desire. She shook her head, her voice hoarse. "I don't know," she said. "It's too much. I can't." Julian lowered the camera, his eyes never leaving hers. "You can," he said. "You're already doing it. You're here with me because you want to, because you're tired of hiding. I see you, Mary, and I want you to see yourself." She looked at him, her eyes glittering in the spotlight. His words were like a knife cutting through her defenses, and she hated him for it, and at the same time, she wanted him to continue. "What if I don't know who I am?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What if I'm just lost?" He set the camera down on the table and walked over to her, kneeling down next to her. He was so close that she could feel the warmth of his body, his breath, his scent tart, with notes of wood and something that made her blood boil. "You're not lost," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You've just forgotten how to feel, but I can remind you." Mary looked at him, her lips trembling. She wanted to push him away, to tell him it was a mistake, that she couldn't. But her body betrayed her. Her hand rose, touched his cheek. Her fingers felt the light stubble. "Julian," she whispered, "this isn't right. I'm married." "I know," he said, his hand covering hers, his fingers warm, strong. "But you're here, and I'm here, and we both know what we want." She closed her eyes, her breathing ragged. She felt her world crumbling, everything she had built, her marriage, her life, her mask disintegrating into dust. But at that moment, she didn't want to think about the consequences. She only wanted him. Their lips met again, and it was an explosion. His kiss was hungry, urgent, full of the life she craved. Her arms went around his neck, her fingers curled into his hair, and she responded with the same passion, the same fire he had ignited in her. They fell onto the velvet, their bodies entwined, and Mary felt her skin burning, her blood boiling, her heart pounding as if it wanted to burst from her chest. "Mary," he whispered, pulling away for a moment, his breathing heavy. "Are you sure?" She looked at him, her eyes full of the fire she had suppressed for so long. "I'm sure," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "I want this. I want you." Their bodies merged, and in that moment there was nothing but the two of them. There was no guilt, no fear, no Ethan. There was only her Mary, the woman who had finally allowed herself to live. Every touch, every breath he took was like paint on the canvas of her black and white world, and she was drowning in those colors, not wanting to get out. It was almost 3 in the morning when Mary got home. She moved as quietly as a shadow, afraid to wake Ethan. But when she entered the bedroom, he was awake. He was sitting up on the bed, his back straight, his eyes full of something she had never seen before, a mixture of pain and anger. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice quiet but with steel in it. Mary froze, her heart pounding. She wanted to lie, to say she was with Catherine, that she was working late, but her lips were still burning from Julian's kisses, her body still remembering his touch. "I was at a photo shoot," she said, her voice weak. "I told you." Ethan looked at her, and his gaze was like a blow. "Until 3 in the morning, he asked. "Mary, what's going on? Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I can't see how you've changed? You barely look at me, barely talk to me. What did I do wrong?" Mary felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say that it wasn't his fault, that it was her, that she was suffocating in their perfect life. But the words caught in her throat, and instead she just shook her head. "It's nothing," she whispered. "I'm just tired." Ethan stood up, his movements jerky and unlike him. "Tired," he repeated, his voice growing louder. "Mary, I'm trying to be a good husband. I'm doing the best I can. But you're slipping away from me, and I don't know how to keep you." She looked at him, and her eyes filled with tears. She saw his pain, his confusion, and it tore at her heart. But she couldn't tell him the truth, not when her body was still singing from another man's touch, when her soul was filled with a fire she hadn't found with him. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Please, Ethan, give me time." He looked at her, his face tense, but he nodded. "Okay," he said, "but don't think I don't notice. I do, Mary, and I don't know how long I can wait." She nodded, unable to speak. She lay down on the bed, facing away from him, and closed her eyes, feeling her world crumble. She was alive, she was full of colors, but those colors were mixed with pain, guilt, and fear. She knew she couldn't go on like this forever, that the breaking point was near. But for now, all she wanted was to drown in this fire, even if it burned her to the ground. The silence in the Carter house was different than usual. Not the familiar, comfortable silence of a perfect morning, with Mary making breakfast and Ethan scrolling through the news on his tablet. It was a silence heavy, almost tangible, like the air before a storm. Mary felt it on her skin, on every nerve, when she walked into the living room on Saturday morning. She was wearing a light robe, her hair still damp from the shower, but inside her there was chaos that she tried to hide behind a familiar smile. Since that night with Julian, after their passionate breakdown, she lived in constant tension, balancing between euphoria and guilt, between the desire to drown in this new fire and the fear of losing everything she had. Ethan sat on the couch, his back straight, as if he were bracing himself for something inevitable. In front of him on the coffee table was her phone, the same one she had left in the living room yesterday, forgotten in her rush after yet another photo shoot. Mary froze, her heart skipping a beat. She knew he never checked her phone, he trusted her, always had. But something in his posture, the way his fingers gripped the arm of the couch, told her that today was different. Ethan, her voice was cautious, almost a whisper, as if she was afraid to scare the silence. Is something wrong? He looked up, and Mary felt her blood run cold. His gaze wasn't angry, wasn't accusing, it was empty. It was as if someone had turned off the light in his eyes, leaving only a cold, emotionless shell. He silently picked up his phone and turned the screen toward her. There was a photograph on it, one of the ones Julian had sent her yesterday. She was lying on dark silk, her eyes glittering in the candlelight, her lips slightly parted, her dress slipping off her shoulder to reveal skin that seemed to glow from within. It wasn't just a photograph, it was her, real, alive, full of a fire Ethan had never seen. Mary felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something, to explain, to lie, to justify herself, but the words stuck like stones. She just stood there, looking at him, feeling her world crumble under that empty gaze. "Who filmed this?" Ethan asked, his voice even, too even, as if he were reading from a script. "And when?" Mary swallowed, her fingers shaking as she clutched the edge of her robe. "It's a photographer," she said, her voice hoarse. "His name is Julian. I went to his photo shoots. I told you." Ethan nodded, but his face remained motionless. "Photo sessions," he repeated, and there was not a drop of emotion in his voice. "And how many were there, Mary? How many times did you go to this, Julian?" She felt her cheeks heat up. She wanted to lie, to say it had only happened a couple of times, that it meant nothing. But his gaze, that cold, empty gaze, made the lie impossible. "A few," she said finally, her voice barely audible. I didn't count." Ethan looked at his phone, his fingers slowly moving across the screen, as if he was trying to find the answer in the photo. "You look different," he said, a hint of pain in his voice that was gone. "I've never seen you like this, not with me." Mary felt her eyes fill with tears. She wanted to scream that it wasn't his fault, that she had tried to be happy with him, that she had tried to be the wife he wanted. But the truth was too hard, too sharp, like a knife she couldn't pull out of her heart. "Ethan," she began, her voice shaking. "It's not what you think. It's just photographs. It's art." He looked at her, and for a moment she thought he was going to scream, throw the phone, and blame her. But instead he just nodded, his face impassive. "Art," he repeated, and the words sounded like a sentence. "You've never looked at me like that, Mary. Never." She opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come, because he was right. She had never looked at him the way she looked at Julian, with hunger, with desire, with a fire that burned her from the inside. She wanted to explain that this wasn't about him, that this was about her emptiness, about her thirst for life. But how could she explain to the man who had always been her rock that his love, his care, his stability, that wasn't what she wanted? "Ethan, she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. Don't, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Don't say anything. I don't want to hear it. He stood up, his movements slow, almost mechanical. He picked up his keys from the table, put on his jacket, and headed for the door. Mary felt her heart squeeze, as if someone had ripped a piece out of it. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice breaking. He stopped at the door, but did not turn around. "I need to think," he said. "Just give me time." And he was gone. The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed in her chest. Mary stood in the middle of the living room, her hands shaking, the tears she had been holding back for so long finally spilling out. She fell onto the sofa, her hands pressed to her face, and began to cry, not quietly, like in the bathroom, hiding from the world, but loudly, breaking into sobs that tore her apart from the inside. His silence was worse than a scream. If he had screamed, accused her, thrown something in anger, she might have defended herself, made excuses, fought. But his silence, his blank stare, his quiet departure, it was like a blow from which there was no recovery. She felt exposed, naked, but not in the way she had with Julian, when her vulnerability had been liberating. It was a nakedness that hurt, that left her defenseless against the truth. She had ruined their marriage, and he knew it. Mary didn't know how much time passed as she sat on the couch, staring into space. Her phone was on the table, the screen still glowing, showing that photo. She picked it up, her fingers shaking as she looked at her face. This woman, so full of life, so full of fire. She hated her and wanted to be her at the same time. This woman wasn't the perfect wife. This wasn't what Mary Ethan knew. This woman was Mary, the one who burned in Julian's studio, the one who allowed herself to want, to feel, to live. Mary sat in her office, looking out at the city through the picture windows, but her mind was far from the glass skyscrapers and the bustle of the streets below. Her fingers fiddled with the edge of her notebook, where she had automatically drawn a few spirals while her team discussed a new advertising campaign. She barely listened, nodding at the right places, but her mind was elsewhere. Julian, his studio, his gaze that seemed to see right through her, and that kiss that had turned her world upside down. Since Ethan left the morning before, she had felt on edge between the desire to throw herself into the abyss Julian had opened for her and the fear of losing everything she knew. But the fear was receding, displaced by the fire that burned inside her when she was with him. She lay awake most of the night, replaying their last meeting in her head, his touch, his words. She needed to see him again, to talk to him, to understand whether it had been a passing passion or something more. She knew she was risking everything, but the thought of staying in her old life, in that black and white world where she was suffocating, was unbearable. She wrote Julian a short message. "Can I meet tonight? I need to talk." His reply came a minute later. "Studio, 8 p.m. Waiting." Mary left the office earlier than usual, citing a headache. She drove across town, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't know what she was going to say, but she knew this was the moment of truth. Her life with Ethan was falling apart, and she was ready to take a step toward Julian, toward the version of herself that felt alive. But somewhere deep inside, there was a fear. What if he didn't want the same? Julian's studio greeted her with the familiar smell of coffee and incense. The light was softer than usual today, just one spotlight casting warm shadows on the brick walls and a few candles, their flames flickering in the draft. Julian was there, fiddling with his camera, but when he saw her, he put it down and smiled. His smile was as warm as ever, with just a hint of danger, but there was something else in it today, something that made her heart clench. "Mary," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't slept all night. "You look determined." She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. She took off her coat and hung it on a hook, her movements slow, as if she were stalling for time. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "About us, about what's going on." Julian nodded, his eyes searching her face. He pointed to an old leather sofa in the corner of the studio, and they sat down, so close that she could feel the warmth of his body. But he didn't touch her, and that lack of touch was like a cold wind. "Speak," he said, his voice soft but wary. "What's on your mind?" Mary took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the hem of her dress navy blue, simple but form-fitting, the one she'd chosen because she knew he liked her to look natural. I can't go on like this," she began, her voice shaking. "With Ethan. With this life. I thought I could, but after everything that happened here, I can't go back. I want to be with you, Julian. I want more." His face remained still, but there was something in his eyes, not joy, not surprise, but something more complex that she couldn't quite place. He leaned back against the sofa, his fingers running through his hair, and sighed. "Mary," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "you don't know what you're getting into." She felt her heart squeeze. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharpening. "You said to yourself that you see me, that you want me. Doesn't that mean something?" Julian looked at her, his eyes dark, almost black in the candlelight. "I see you," he said, "and I want you as a muse, as a woman, as a work of art. You inspire me, Mary. You make me see things I've never seen before. But relationships, that's not my thing. I'm not the guy who makes plans, buys a house, starts a family. I live in the moment, and you're my moment." Mary felt her blood run cold. His words were like a blow, not a sharp one, but a slow, deep one, like a knife that enters the flesh almost imperceptibly. "So," she began, her voice breaking, "so to you, is this just art? I'm just a muse, not a person." He shook his head, his face tense. "Not like that," he said quickly. "You're not just a muse. Your drama, Mary. Your passion, your pain, your life. I see it in every look you give me, in every move you make. I want to capture it, to show the world who you are. But love, permanence, that's not me. I can't give you what you want." Mary looked at him, her eyes filling with tears, but she wouldn't let them fall. She felt naked, exposed, as if he had taken off not only her clothes, but her skin, revealing everything she had been hiding. "You used me," she said, her voice quiet but steely. "All this time, you knew that I was falling into you, and you just filmed it like I was a painting." Julian frowned, his hand reaching out for her, but stopping a centimeter from her shoulder. "I didn't use you," he said, his voice firm but with a hint of guilt. "I was honest with you, Mary. I never promised you a future. I told you I wanted to see the real you, and you let me. You wanted it as much as I did." She laughed, but the laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. "Wanted to?" she asked, her voice growing louder. "Julian, I ruined my life for this, for you. My husband, he saw your pictures. He left, and I thought that you felt the same way I did, and you're telling me that I'm just your moment." He looked at her, his face tense, as if he was struggling with himself. "I feel," he said finally. "Damn it, Mary, I feel more than I should. But I can't be who you want me to be. I'm not Ethan. I'm not coming home at 6 o'clock, planning vacations, building a life with you. I'm an artist. I live for what I see, what I feel, what I can create. And you're the most beautiful thing I've ever created." Mary felt her heart break. His words were beautiful, but they were like poison, sweet and deadly. She stood up, her legs shaking, but she forced herself to stand up straight. "I'm not a painting, Julian," she said, her voice cold, but the tears still escaped, sliding down her cheeks. "I'm a person. I'm alive. And I thought you saw me, not some images." He stood up, his face close to hers, and for a moment she thought he was going to hug her, kiss her, tell her he was wrong. But he just looked, his eyes full of something she couldn't quite place: regret, desire, pain. "I see you," he said quietly, "but I can't be who you need. I'm sorry." Mary shook her head, her tears flowing freely, but she made no attempt to stop them. "You don't understand," she said. "I didn't want you to be Ethan. I wanted you to be yourself. But you don't even know who that is." She turned, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. Julian stepped after her, his hand touching her elbow, but she pulled away. "Mary, wait," he said, his voice full of desperation. "We can go on. We can film, we can be together, just not the way you want." She stopped at the door, her hand clutching the handle. "I don't want to be your muse, Julian," she said without turning around. "I want to be loved. And if you can't give me that, then I have no business here." She opened the door and walked out without looking back. The cold air hit her face, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt only an emptiness that was worse than the one she had felt with Ethan. She had been a shadow then, but now she was a broken mirror that reflected all her mistakes, all her desires, all her losses. Mary returned home, but the house felt strange. Ethan was gone, he hadn't returned since yesterday morning, and his silence still hung in the air like a ghost. She went into the bedroom, lay down on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. Her body still remembered Julian, his touch, his kisses, his voice. But now she knew it was an illusion. He didn't love her. He loved her image, her drama, her passion, but not her. Not Mary, not the woman who wanted to be more than a work of art. She picked up her phone and opened the pictures he'd sent her. Her face, her eyes, her body, they were all beautiful, but she saw them differently now. This wasn't her. This was a version of her he'd created for him. She deleted the pictures one by one, her fingers shaking, but she didn't stop. When the screen went blank, she felt a strange sense of relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her. But the emptiness remained. She knew she'd lost Ethan, maybe not forever, but his departure was a crack she didn't know how to mend. And now she'd lost Julian not because he was gone, but because he'd never been hers. She was alone, and the thought was both terrifying and liberating. Mary closed her eyes, her breathing ragged. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She couldn't be a shadow anymore. She wanted to be alive, even if it meant pain, even if it meant starting over. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe she could do it not for Ethan, not for Julian, but for herself. Morning came with gray light filtering through the heavy bedroom curtains. Mary lay in bed, her body still, but her insides churning like a river about to burst its banks. The house that had once been her refuge now seemed too big, too empty. The silence was no longer comfortable, it was deafening, as if the walls had absorbed her pain and were now echoing it back. Ethan had been gone for 3 days. His clothes were still in the closet, his toothbrush in the bathroom, but his absence was a hole she couldn't ignore. Julian had disappeared from her life, too, not physically, but emotionally, since that conversation when he'd made it clear she was just a muse to him, not a woman he could love. For the first time in 7 years, Mary was alone, truly alone. She rose from the bed, her movements slow, almost mechanical. The robe she had pulled on was old, soft cotton, not the silk she usually wore to play the perfect wife. She went down to the kitchen, but she didn't bother making coffee or making breakfast. Instead, she sat at the table, staring at the empty cup that had been left over from the night before. Her fingers slid along the rim of the ceramic, her thoughts swirling like autumn leaves in the wind. She didn't know who she was anymore, not Mary Carter, not someone's wife, not someone's muse, just Mary. And it scared her to the point of trembling, but at the same time, there was something new in that emptiness, something that made her breathe deeper. The phone vibrated on the table, and she jumped. A message from Ethan appeared on the screen. "We need to talk. Today, 6 p.m. at home." Her heart sank. She knew what that meant. She knew he didn't just want to talk. But instead of panic, she felt a strange calm. She was tired of running from the truth, tired of hiding behind masks. If this was the end, she wanted to meet it with an open face. Ethan walked into the house promptly at 6, as if his internal clock was never out of order. He was wearing a dark suit, but his tie was slightly loosened, and there was a weariness in his eyes that Mary had never noticed before. He didn't smile or kiss her forehead, as he always did. Instead, he simply sat down on the living room couch, placing a file folder on the coffee table. Mary stood by the window, her arms crossed over her chest, as if she were trying to protect herself from what was about to happen. "I filed for divorce," he said, his voice even, but with a heaviness she'd never heard before. "The papers are here. I want it to be fair. custody of the kids, 50/50ths, if that's okay with you. Mary felt her throat tighten. They had no children, and his words about shared custody were like a knife, reminding her of what they had never created together. She knew he had misspoken, that it was just a formality, but it still cut her like a shard of glass. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked over to the sofa, sitting down across from him. "Ethan," she began, her voice hoarse, I didn't mean for this to happen." He looked at her, and there was pain in his eyes, but not anger. It was worse than if he had shouted. His silence, his calm, tore at her heart more than any scandal. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you didn't mean to. But you've changed, Mary. You're not mine anymore, and I can't pretend I don't see it." She looked down, her fingers gripping the edge of the sofa. "I tried," she said, her voice shaking. "I tried to be who you wanted, but I couldn't. I was suffocating, Ethan. I didn't know how to tell you." He nodded, his face still, but his hands, resting on his knees, were shaking slightly. "I tried too," he said. "I thought I was giving you everything you needed. A home, stability, love. But apparently it wasn't enough. Or I wasn't enough." Mary shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "It's not about you," she said. "It's about me. I lost myself, and I thought I could find myself somewhere else. But I was wrong." Ethan looked at her, and for a moment she thought he was going to stand up, hug her, tell her they could fix this. But instead, he just nodded. "I don't want to keep you if you don't want to be here," he said. "I loved you, Mary, and I guess I always will, but I can't live with a shadow." She felt tears slide down her cheeks, but she made no attempt to wipe them away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't be what you deserved." He stood up, his movements slow, as if he was carrying an invisible load on his shoulders. "The documents are on the table," he said. "Read them and sign them when you're ready. I'll be staying with my brother until we sort this out." Mary nodded, unable to speak. She watched him walk toward the door, his back, so familiar, disappearing over the threshold. The door closed with a soft click, and the sound was like a period in their story. She was alone, in a house that had once been theirs, but now seemed alien. Mary didn't know how long she sat on the couch, staring at the file. Her fingers trembled when she finally opened it. The papers were dry, formal, full of legalese that sliced their 7-year marriage into neat pieces. Property division, no claims, signatures. So simple, so cold. She closed the file without finishing and leaned back against the couch, feeling her chest tighten with pain. She was alone. Without Ethan, without Julian, without the masks she had worn for years. For the first time in her life, she was just Mary, not a wife, not a muse, not a professional, but a woman who had to figure out who she was and what she wanted. It was terrifying, but there was something else in that emptiness, freedom. She felt her lungs filling up, as if she could breathe deeply for the first time in a long time. Mary stood up and went to the window, looking out at the city that was living its own life, oblivious to her pain. She thought about Julian, about his studio, about how he made her feel alive, but now she realized that he was not the answer. He was a spark, but not a fire. The fire was inside her, and she would have to learn to light it without anyone else's help. She picked up her phone, but she didn't call anyone. Instead, she opened her notes and began writing not for anyone, but for herself. "I'm Mary. I'm 35. I don't know who I am, but I want to find out." They were simple words, but they were like the first step on a new path. The pain was still there, sharp and deep, but it no longer choked her. It was as much a part of her as her breath, as much as her heartbeat. That evening, Mary went out into the street. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet carried her forward, through the lantern-lit streets, through the noise of a city that had a life of its own. She stopped at a small cafe where she had once sat with Ethan in the first months of their marriage. They laughed, held hands, and made plans. Now she sat alone with a cup of black coffee, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't frighten her. She was alone, but not lonely. She was with herself, and that was enough. Mary knew there would be difficult days ahead talking to lawyers, signing papers, sharing the life they had built together. But she also knew this was her chance. A chance to find herself, not through Ethan, not through Julian, but through her own desires, her own mistakes, her own victories. She was sick, but she was breathing. And in that breath was life real, without pretense, without masks. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could be herself. And that was the beginning. Mary sat in her new office, a small but cozy space overlooking the river that she had rented after her, and Ethan's house had been sold and their property divided. It was her first step toward independence, toward a new life where she could simply be Mary, not a wife, not a muse, but a woman learning to reinvent herself. She had been working on a new advertising campaign, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her mind teeming with ideas that for the first time in a long time felt like her own. But this morning, filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and hope, was shattered by a single notification. Her phone vibrated, and a text from Catherine popped up. "Mary, what the hell? Did you see that?" A screenshot followed, a social media post from Julian's gallery announcing his new exhibition, Naked Truth. The cover photo was of her, Mary, lying on dark silk, her eyes blazing, her dress slipping slightly off her shoulder, her skin glowing in the candlelight. It was one of the photos Julian had taken on their last night, when she had given in to passion, when her world had come crashing down. She had never consented to their publication. Mary felt her blood run cold. Her fingers trembled as she opened the gallery's website. There were more photos, her face, her body, her emotions, laid out for all to see. The captions were full of high-flown words about vulnerability and the human condition, but to Mary it was like a stab in the back. Julian hadn't just used her as a muse, he'd stolen her intimacy, her pain, and turned it into his art without asking permission. She dialed his number, her hands shaking with rage. After 3 rings, he answered, his voice as hoarse and careless as ever. "Mary," he said, and there was a slight mockery in his tone, "I guess you saw the exhibition." "How dare you?" Her voice was cold, but trembling with suppressed rage. "You didn't ask me, Julian. These are my photos, my life. You had no right." He paused, and she could almost hear him shrug. "Art doesn't ask permission, Mary," he said. "You were part of something bigger. These pictures, they're not just about you. They're about all of us, about the truth." "The truth?" She almost screamed, her voice breaking. "This is my truth, Julian. You stole it. You put me naked in front of the whole world, and you call it art?" "You were amazing," he said, and there was a sincerity in his voice that only made her angrier. "You inspired me, Mary. These pictures show the real you. Isn't that what you wanted?" "I wanted to be seen," she said, her voice quieter but still steely. "Not for sale. You used me, Julian, and I will never forgive you for it." She hung up before he could answer. Her chest heaved, tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She opened social media and watched as the photos spread like a virus. The comments were like knives. Some called her brave and stunning, others shameless and a disgrace. Her name, her face, her emotions were public property, and everyone felt entitled to judge. The scandal escalated quickly. By midday, local bloggers and media outlets had picked up the story. "Prominent businessman's wife in provocative photo shoot," the headline screamed, tearing her reputation to shreds. Mary turned off her phone when the calls from colleagues and acquaintances became unbearable. She sat in her office, looking out over the river, feeling her world crumbling again. But this time, she wasn't going to hide. Catherine arrived an hour later, her face pale with excitement. "Mary, this is terrible," she said, sitting down opposite. "How could he? Are you going to sue?" Mary looked at her, her eyes dry but determined. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she said, "but I won't be a victim. Not again." Catherine frowned. "What do you mean? You can't just ignore it. People say horrible things. They call you." "I know what they call me," Mary interrupted, her voice firm. "And I don't care. This isn't about them. This is about me, about what he stole from me. and I'm going to give it back." She turned on her laptop and started writing. Not a letter to her lawyer, not a complaint, but a post on social media. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, words pouring out like water from a burst dam. "My name is Mary Carter. You've seen my photographs. They were taken without my consent. They were my moment of vulnerability, my moment of truth, and they were stolen. But I'm not ashamed. I won't hide. I'm a woman who is searching for herself, and I won't let anyone define me through their lens. This is my story, and I'm going to tell it myself." She posted it without rereading it. Catherine looked at her, her eyes full of admiration and fear. "Are you sure?" she asked. It's like challenging the whole world." "I'm tired of being afraid," Mary replied. "Let them say what they want. I'm not a shadow anymore." By the evening, her post had gone viral. People were sharing it, commenting, arguing. Some were supportive, calling her brave. Others were still judging. But Mary didn't read the comments. She felt her chest expand, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. She contacted a lawyer to sue Julian for violating her rights, but that wasn't the point. The point was that she was no longer allowing anyone, not Ethan, not Julian, not society, to define who she was. A few days later, she was invited to appear on a talk show about privacy rights. She agreed, though her knees shook as she sat down in front of the cameras. The host, a woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice, asked, "Mary, you have become a symbol for many women who feel their privacy has been violated. What do you want to say to those who look at you now?" Mary looked into the camera, her voice calm but strong. "You have a right to your story," she said. "No one can take it away from you. Don't let anyone tell you who you are. And don't be afraid to be vulnerable. It's not a weakness, it's a strength." After the show, her inbox was flooded with letters from women and men sharing their stories, their fears, their triumphs. Mary began working with privacy groups, and soon her voice became louder than she could have imagined. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, helped others find the strength to speak up. The scandal that could have broken her became her platform. A year passed. Mary stood on the balcony of her new apartment, small but hers, overlooking the river that flowed like her life, calm but unstoppable. The divorce from Ethan was final. They had signed the papers without scandal, without accusations. He had wished her luck, and there was a sincerity in his voice that still hurt her. They had corresponded occasionally, but their paths had diverged, and Mary knew it was for the best. Julian disappeared from her life. His exhibition had caused controversy, but after her lawsuit and public outcry, the gallery pulled the photographs and he publicly apologized. Mary hadn't forgiven him, but she held no grudge. He had been part of her journey, the spark that helped her light her own fire. But that fire was now hers alone. She was working for her company, which now specialized in campaigns promoting female strength and authenticity. She was writing a book not about Julian, not about Ethan, but about herself, about her journey to becoming a woman who was unafraid to be herself. Some nights she would be overcome with longing for what could have been, for the mistakes she had made. But that longing was a part of her, as was her strength, as was her breath. Mary stepped out onto the balcony, holding a cup of tea. The city sparkled below, as vibrant and unpredictable as her new life. She smiled, feeling the wind brush her face. She was alone, but not lonely. She was Mary, not someone's wife, not someone's muse, but a woman who had finally found herself. And that was enough. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.